American Men of Mind by Burton Egbert Stevenson, Chapter 5, Sculptors, Part 2. One of the most engaging and versatile personalities in the whole range of American art was that of William Wetmore Story. Born at Salem, Massachusetts in 1819, graduated at Harvard, admitted to the bar, the author of a volume of graceful verse and of a valuable life of his father, Chief Justice Story, he yet, in 1851, put all his work aside, adopted sculpture as a profession, and, proceeding to Rome, opened a studio there. It was from the first an extraordinary studio, attracting the most brilliant people of Rome in literature as well as art. And if Story did not quite practice the perfection he was somewhat fond of preaching, it was because of his very versatility, which absorbed his talent in so many directions that it could not be concentrated in any way. His imagination outran his achievement, and the most famous of his works, his statue of Cleopatra, owes its reputation not so much to its own merit, which is far from overwhelming, as to the ecstatic description of it which Nathaniel Hawthorne included in The Marble Faun. A master of literature is not necessarily an inspired critic of art, and it is to be suspected that Hawthorne permitted some of the fire of his imagination to play about the cold and uninspired marble. Cleopatra marked Story's culmination. He fell away from it year by year, producing a long line of figures whose only impressive features were the names he gave them: the Libyan Sibyl, Semiramis, Salome, Medea, and so on. However, he did much to increase the popularity of sculpture, for the stories he attempted to tell in stone by means of heavy-browed, frowning women in classic costume and with classic names were exactly suited to the childlike intelligence of his public. He gave art, too, as William Penn gave the Quakers, a sort of social sanction because of his own social position. If the son of Chief Justice Story could turn sculptor, surely that profession was not so irregular after all. Another sculptor who shared with Story the admiration of the public was Randolph Rogers, born at Waterloo, New York, in 1825. Until the age of 23, such modeling as he did was done in the spare moments of a business life. But when he gave an exhibition of the results of this labor, his employers were so impressed that they provided the money needed to send him to Italy, where he was to spend the remainder of his life, with the exception of 5 years' residence in New York. Two of his earlier figures are his most famous, his Nydia and his Lost Pleiad. Scores of replicas in marble of these two figures were made during their author's lifetime, and they still retain for many people a simple and pathetic charm. Nearly every one, of course, has made the acquaintance of Nydia, the blind girl, in Bulwer Lytton's The Last Days of Pompeii, and so gaze at Rogers' fleeing figure with eyes too sympathetic to see its faults. Far more important is the work of William H. Reinhardt, of the same age as Rogers, and resembling him somewhat in development. Born on a Maryland farm, his early years were those of the average farmer's boy, but at last some blind instinct led him to abandon farming for stone cutting, and he became assistant to a mason and stone cutter of the neighborhood. As soon as he had learned his trade, at the age of 21, he went to Baltimore, where there was work in plenty, and where he could, at the same time, attend the night schools of the Maryland Institute. This sounds much easier than it really was. To devote the evenings to study, after 10 and often 12 hours of the hardest of all manual labor, required grit and moral courage such as few possess. He was soon trying his hand at modeling, and convinced, at last, that sculpture was his vocation. He managed, by the time he was 30, to save enough money for a short period of study at Rome. 3 years of work at Baltimore. After that, gave him some reputation, and he then returned to Rome to spend the remainder of his life there. If you have ever visited the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, you have seen, in the Hall of Statuary, one of Reinhardt's most characteristic groups, Latona and her children. The mother, half seated, half lying upon the ground, gazes tenderly down at the two sleeping children, sheltered in the folds of her mantle. The whole work possesses a serene poetic charm and dignity very noteworthy. and this and other groups are among the most beautiful that any American ever turned out of an Italian studio. Reinhardt was one of the last American disciples of the classic school. Certainly, no art could have been more opposed to his than the frank and vivid realism of his immediate successor, John Rogers. Born in Salem, Massachusetts, the son of a family of merchants, he was educated in the common schools, worked for a time in a store, and then entered a machine shop as an apprentice, working up through all the grades until finally he was in charge of a railroad repair shop. During all these years, he had no suspicion of artistic talent within himself, but one day in Boston, he happened to see a man modeling some images in clay. In that instant, the artist instinct clutched him, and procuring some clay and modeling tools, he spent all his leisure in practice. This leisure was scant enough, for his trade kept him employed 14 hours of every day. But at the age of 29, he was able to secure an 8-month vacation, which he spent in Europe, principally at Paris and Rome. He returned to America greatly discouraged, for the only thing he saw in Europe was classic sculpture, with which he had no sympathy, and which, indeed, he could not understand. So, abandoning all thought of making sculpture a profession, he went to work as a draftsman in Chicago, amusing himself at odd hours by the construction of a group of small figures which he called the checker players. It was exhibited at a charity fair, and awakened so much interest and delight that Rogers burned his bridges behind him by resigning his position and proceeding to New York, and rented a studio, determined to be a sculptor in spite of classicism. The outbreak of the Civil War furnished him a host of subjects which he treated with a patriotic fervor that went straight to the heart of an overwrought people. The returned volunteer, the picket guard, the sharpshooters, the campfire, one more shot, and many others came from his studio in rapid succession. They were all thoroughly American, and some were even admirably sculptural. They, at least, stood for an original idea, and deserved better treatment than the silent contempt which, in these days, is about all that has been accorded them. At about this time, there came upon the scene the first and only really famous woman sculptor in the history of American art, Harriet Hosmer. She had had an unusual childhood, and had grown into an original and engaging woman. Born in 1830 at Watertown, Massachusetts, the daughter of a physician, she inherited her mother's delicate constitution, and her father encouraged her in an outdoor life of physical exercise such as only boys at that time were accustomed to. She became expert in rowing, riding, skating, and shooting, developed great endurance, filled her room with snakes and insects and birds' nests, and in a clay pit at the end of her father's garden modeled rude figures of animals. A few years of schooling followed this wild girlhood. Then she was sent to Boston to study drawing and modeling, but finding that no woman would be admitted to the Boston Medical School, whose course in anatomy she was anxious to take, she went to St. Louis and entered the medical college there. Finally, in 1852, accompanied by her father and Charlotte Cushman, she set sail for Italy. She remained there for 8 years, turning out a number of very creditable figures, which, if not great, at least possess some measure of grace and charm. Nathaniel Hawthorne, in his Italian notebook, has left a vivid impression of Miss Hosmer, whose eccentricity of dress and manner impressed him deeply, as did also the work which she showed him, but she never reached any high development. Which brings us to the present of American art, for the sculptors we have yet to consider are either yet alive or have died so recently that they belong to the present rather than the past. The first and one of the most important of these is John Quincy Adams Ward, born in 1830 on an Ohio farm. An accident showed the possession of latent talent, for some good pottery clay happened to be discovered on his father's farm, and his guardian angel inspired the boy to take a handful of it and model the grotesque countenance of a Negro servant. The result was striking, and no doubt he felt within himself some of the stirrings of genius, but not until 1849 did he realize his vocation. Then, while on a visit to a sister in Brooklyn, he happened to pass the open door of H.K. Brown's studio. The glimpse he caught of the scene within fascinated him. He returned again and again, and ended by entering the studio as a pupil. He could have found no better master, and for 7 years he remained there, assisting Brown in every detail of his work. His first group, modeled after long study, was his Indian Hunter, now placed in Central Park, New York, a group instinct with vitality, a glimpse of a forgotten past, evoked with the skill of a master. It was the first of a long line of statues, many of them portraits of contemporaries, a field in which Ward has no superior. It is perhaps the highest tribute which could be paid the man to say that, with all his great production, he has never done bad work, never produced anything trifling or unworthy. A fellow student with Ward in Henry Kirk Brown's studio was Larkin G. Mead, the first indication of whose talent was a unique one. One winter morning, about the middle of the century, the good people of Brattleboro, Vermont, were astonished to find set up in one of the public squares of the town a colossal snow image in the form of a majestic angel, crude, no doubt, in execution, but singularly effective. Inquiry developed that it was the work of young Mead, then only 15 years of age. The incident got into the newspapers, magnified considerably, and attracted the attention of old Nicholas Longworth of Cincinnati, who, on more than one occasion, had himself appeared as angel to struggling artists. It was so in this case. Mr. Longworth wrote to Brattleboro, making some inquiries as to the essential truth of the story, and having satisfied himself on that point, offered to help the boy to get an artistic education. The offer was accepted, and young Mead was placed in Brown's studio, going afterwards to Italy. While there, he heard of the assassination of President Lincoln and prepared an elaborate design in plaster for a national monument to the martyred president's memory. As soon as this was completed, he started for home with it, arriving at precisely the right moment. The rage for monument building was sweeping up and down the land. Councils, legislatures, all sorts of public and private bodies were making appropriations to commemorate some particular hero of the Civil War which just ended. Mead's design appealed to the popular imagination, and the commission was awarded him. The monument, which was destined to cost $250,000, was by far the most important that had ever been erected in this country, and the inexperienced young sculptor sailed back to Italy to begin work. Not until 1874 was it sufficiently completed to dedicate, and the last group of statuary was not put in place until 10 years later. All this time, the sculptor had spent quietly in his studio at Florence, quite apart from the world of progress or of new ideas in art, and long before his work was finished, public taste had outgrown it and found it uninspired and commonplace. Much more important to American art is the work of Olin Levy Warner, the son of an itinerant Methodist preacher whose wanderings prevented the boy getting any regular schooling. During his childhood, he had shown considerable talent for carving statuettes in chalk, and he finally decided to immortalize his father by carving a portrait bust of him. For a stone, he set a barrel of plaster in one solid mass, and then, breaking off the staves, began hacking away at it with such poor implements as he could command. It was a well-nigh endless task, but it's dogged that does it, and the boy worked doggedly away until the bust was completed. It was considered such a success that young Warner, convinced of his vocation, set to work to earn enough money to go abroad. For 6 years he worked as a telegrapher, and it was not until 1869, when he was 25 years old, that he had saved the money needed. 3 years later, he returned to New York and opened a studio, but met with a reception so dismal and indifferent that after a 4 years' desperate struggle, he was forced to abandon the fight and return to his father's farm. Anxious for any employment, he applied to Henry Plant, president of the Southern Express Company, for work. Mr. Plant was interested, and instead of offering him a job as messenger or teamster, gave him a commission for 2 portrait busts. It was the turning point in Warner's career, for the busts he produced were of a craftsmanship so delicate and beautiful that they at once established his position among his fellow sculptors, though years elapsed before he received any wide public recognition. The truth is that he was too great and sincere an artist to cater to a public taste which he had himself outgrown, so that until quite recently he has remained a sculptor's sculptor. His untimely death in 1896 from the effects of a fall while riding in Central Park brought forth a notable tribute from his fellow craftsmen, and students of sculpture have come to recognize in him one of the most delicate and truly inspired artists in our history. But the most powerful influence in the recent development of American sculpture has been that great artist, Augustus Saint-Gaudens. Born in 1848 at Dublin, Ireland, of a French father and an Irish mother, he was brought to this country while still an infant. Perhaps this mixed ancestry explains to some degree Saint-Gaudens' peculiar genius. At the age of 13, he was apprenticed to a cameo cutter in New York City, and worked for 6 years at this employment, which demands the utmost keenness of vision, delicacy of touch, and refinement of manner. His evenings he spent in studying drawing, first at Cooper Union, and then, outgrowing that, at the National Academy of Design. So it happened that, at the age of 20, when most men were just beginning their special studies, Saint-Gaudens was thoroughly grounded in drawing and an expert in low relief. Another thing he had learned, and let us pause here to lay stress upon it, for it is a thing which must be learned before any great life work can be done. He had learned the value of systematic industry, of putting in so many hours every day at faithful work. The weak artist, whether in stone or paint or ink, always contends that he must wait for inspiration, and so excuses long periods of unproductive idleness, during which he grows weaker and weaker for lack of exercise. The great artist compels inspiration by whipping himself to his work and setting grimly about it, knowing that the inspiration, so called, will come. For inspiration is only seeing a thing clearly, and the one way to see it clearly is to keep the eyes and mind fixed upon it. At the age of 20, then, Saint-Gaudens was not only a trained artist, but an industrious one. 3 years in the inspiring atmosphere of Paris and 3 years in Italy followed, and finally, in 1874, he landed again at New York with such an equipment as few sculptors ever had. And 7 years later, he proved his mastery when his statue of Admiral Farragut was unveiled in Union Square, New York. That superb work of art made its author a national figure, and Saint-Gaudens took definitely that place at the head of American sculpture, which was his until his death. 6 years later, Saint-Gaudens' Lincoln was unveiled in Lincoln Park, Chicago, and was at once recognized as the greatest portrait statue in the United States. It has remained so, a masterpiece of exalted conception and dignified execution. Other statues followed, each memorable in its way, but Saint-Gaudens proved himself not only the greatest, but the most versatile of our sculptors by his work in other fields. By portraits in high and low relief, by ideal figures, and notably by the memorial to Robert Gould Shaw, a work distinctively American and without a counterpart in the annals of art. It is the spiritual quality of Saint-Gaudens' work which sets it apart upon a lofty pinnacle, the largeness of the man behind it, the artist mind, and the poet heart. Saint-Gaudens' death in 1907 deprived American art of one of its most commanding figures. But there are other American sculptors alive today whose work is noteworthy in a high degree. One of these is Daniel Chester French, born of a substantial New England family and showing no special artistic talent in youth. One day, in his 19th year, he surprised his family by showing them the grotesque figure of a frog in clothes which he had carved from a turnip. Modeling tools were secured for him, and he went to work. The schooling which prepared him for his remarkable career was the slightest. He studied for a month with J.Q.A. Ward, and for the rest worked out his own salvation as best he could. His first important commission came to him at the age of 23, the figure of the Minuteman for the Battle Monument at Concord, Massachusetts. It was unveiled on April 19, 1875, and attracted wide attention. For here was a work of strength and originality produced by a young man without schooling or experience, produced, too, without a model, or at least from nothing but a large cast of the Apollo Belvedere, which was the only model the sculptor had. But there was no hint of that famous figure under the clothes of the Minuteman. It had been entirely concealed by the personality and vigor he had impressed upon his work. After that, Mr. French spent a year in Florence, but he returned to America at the end of that period to remain. He has grown steadily in power and certainty of touch, rising perhaps to his greatest height in his famous group, The Angel of Death and The Young Sculptor, intended as a memorial to Martin Milmore, but touching the universal heart by its deep appeal, conveyed with a sure and admirable artistry. Mr. French's great distinction is to have created a good sculpture which has touched the public heart, and to have done this with no concession to public taste. Another sculptor who has gained a wide appreciation is Frederick Mac Monies, who for sheer audacity and dexterity of manipulation is almost without a rival. He was born in Brooklyn in 1863. His father, a Scotchman who had come to New York at the age of 18, and his mother, a niece of Benjamin West. The boy's talent revealed itself early, and was developed in the face of many difficulties. Obliged to leave school while still a child and to earn his living as a clerk in a jewelry store, he still found time to study drawing, and at the age of 16 had the good fortune to attract the attention of Saint-Gaudens, who received him as an apprentice in his studio. No better fate could have befallen the lad, and the 5 years spent with Saint-Gaudens gave him the best of all training in the fundamentals of his art. Some years in Paris followed, where he replenished his slender purse with such work as he could find to do, until in 1889 his Diana emerged from his studio radiant and superb. A year later came his statue of Nathan Hale, and there was never any lack of commissions after that. Nathan Hale stands in City Hall Park, New York City, the very embodiment of that devoted young patriot. The artist has shown him at the supreme moment when, facing the scaffold, he uttered the memorable words which still thrill the American heart, and expression and sentiment were never more perfectly in accord. He struck the same high note with his famous fountain at Chicago Exposition, where hundreds of thousands of people suddenly discovered in this young man a national possession to be proud of. A year later, his name was again in every mouth, when the Boston Public Library refused a place to perhaps his greatest work, the dancing Bacchante, which has since found refuge in the Metropolitan Museum at New York, a composition so original and daring that it astonishes while it delights. Like Mac Monies, George Gray Barnard began life as a jeweler's apprentice, became an expert engraver and letterer, and finally, urged by a ceaseless longing, deserted that lucrative profession for the extremely uncertain one of sculpture. A year and a half of study in Chicago brought him an order for a portrait bust of a little girl, and with the $350 he received for this, he set off for Paris. That meager sum supported him for 3 years and a half, with what privation and self-denial may be imagined, but he never complained. He lived, indeed, the life of a recluse, shutting himself up in his studio with his work, emerging only at night to walk the streets of Paris, lost in dreams of ambition. That from this period of ordeal came some of the deep emotion which marks his work cannot be doubted. This quality which sets Barnard apart is well illustrated in his famous group, The Two Natures, suggested by a line of Victor Hugo. "I feel two natures struggling within me." Two male figures are shown, heroic in size and powerfully modeled, a victor half erect bending over a prostrate foe. Besides these men, who are, in a way, the giants of the American sculptors of today, there are, especially in New York, many others whose work is graceful and distinctive. Paul Wayland Bartlett, Herbert Adams, Charles Niehaus, John J. Boyle, Frank Elwell, Frederick Ruckstuhl, to mention only a few of them, are all men of originality and power, whose work is a pleasure and an inspiration, and to whose hands the future of American sculpture may safely be confided. End of Chapter 5, Part 2. Recording by William Tomko.